with this aircraft, there are 6 emergency exits.
Hello, everybody. This is Rod, your captain speaking. We are currently 30,000 feet in the air, and we haven't even left the airport. We just lit the joint. Just kidding, a little pilot humor there. We like to have fun. Our destination today is Casablanca, Morocco. So everyone, sit back, fasten your seatbelts, and prepare for takeoff. We will be arriving in 6 hours.
7-footers, welcome back to another episode. Jarod here. Really excited for today's episode. We have 2 outstanding guests with us. First up from Arizona, Victoria Jackson. She is a sports historian and assistant professor of history at Arizona State University, where she lectures, writes, and speaks about the intersection of sport and society, exploring how the games we play and watch tell us much about the communities in which we live. She teaches courses that are part of an undergraduate certificate that is affiliated with the Global Sports Institute at the Arizona State University. Victoria, how are you?
Healthy, so that's good. Thanks.
Very good. Next up for the Bay Area is Andy Schwarz. He is the Chief Innovation Officer and co-founder of the Professional Collegiate Basketball League, and that is with Ricky Valenti and ex-NBA player David West. And he's an antitrust economist by trade with a subspecialty in sports economics. He served as a case manager for the NFL and for a series of plaintiffs' class lawsuits suing the NCAA, which is awesome, which is why he's here. He was one of the sponsors of the California SB 206 bill, which, of course, is the first step in helping restore collegiate athletes' name, image, and likeness rights in the state of California. Andy, how are you?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for being here. Okay, guys, I kind of want to get into this, right? So with the COVID pandemic, the idea is that the future of sports, both professionally and collegiate, will change. Obviously college because of the model that they have. But Andy, I want to kind of start with you. Can you just take our listeners through sort of the 30,000-foot view of how the NCAA and its member institutions and college athletics works from an economic perspective?
Wow. How much time do we have?
You got to do the short version.
That's really hard for me. I'm an economist. I mean, the simple fact is that college athletics, especially in the high revenue sports, because they're all revenue sports, but they're high revenue sports, is able to take advantage of the fact that college athletes' output value, the value of putting a bunch of football players together into a machine to generate some football, is higher than the cost of a scholarship. So that generates a profit, a surplus. And because they collude and essentially get together once a year and agree on a maximum, let's just use economic terms, maximum wage. It doesn't mean that I'm saying that they aren't employees, but that the compensation that they receive is capped. That allows them to generate this surplus and then decide how they're going to distribute it. The fact that some of those schools choose to spend it all doesn't mean they didn't make money any more than the fact that if I choose to buy a yacht, doesn't mean that being an economist is a lucrative profession just because I spent it on a yacht.
Well said. Victoria, one of the things that I forgot to mention in your bio is of course, you were an undergraduate track athlete at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and a postgraduate athlete at Arizona State University. You and I have talked several times about benefiting from being a track athlete as a result of the revenue-generating sports. Can you talk a little bit about that for our listeners?
Yeah, thanks. Well, I really like how Andy kind of clarified that they're all revenue generating or value generating for universities, because I think that's really true. We tend to dismiss what the schools get out of having these kind of broad, expansive athletic departments, because it provides them a lot of different ways that they can justify ratcheting up the pressure on those that generate the most revenue to make even more. So that was kind of a cool framing. But yeah, I mean, I often say that I'm a beneficiary of collegiate amateurism. I got a world-class education and a world-class athletic experience and turned pro in both. Now that, I'm with a PhD and a member of the faculty, but I also ran professionally for Nike for a few years. And it's because of the system working to support people like me while exploiting those who make all the money in football and basketball. So yeah, I mean, all of this is, thinking about the broader context and framing around the future of all this. It's going to be really interesting to see how institutions of higher education navigate balancing all the various pressures moving forward.
Yeah.
So before we go forward, I think it'd be good if you don't mind, if we talk a little bit about the word that Victoria used, which is exploit. Mm-hmm. I get a lot of pushback from people. How can you say that a free education, someone getting a free education, 3 square meals a day, a nice dorm to live in, road travel, getting to see all sorts of wonderful places like
the swag, Andy, and the swag, they get backpacks
and the swag
and stuff.
Clothes, right? How can you say someone's being exploited? So I always find it useful to talk about what the economic definition of exploitation is. When we think in economics about exploitation, it's not about are you making a lot or are you making a little, but are you making less than what you're worth? So you could have somebody working in a functioning market, and the going rate, appropriate rate, is $15 an hour. Earning $15 an hour is not being exploited in an economic sense. Earning $13 an hour would be. You can have somebody in a situation, like again, to use me as an example, I get hundreds of dollars per hour when I'm doing consulting for lawyers. If all the lawyers got together and they agreed that they were only going to pay me $75 an hour, $75 an hour to a lot of people is a ton of money. But that would still be a form of economic exploitation because they were using their collusion, their market power, getting together and agreeing not to pay me market wage to depress my wage. When I say that college athletes are being exploited, I'm not saying that they are being given bread and water and held in a cage. What I'm saying is that if there weren't an agreement among the 354 D1 schools not to pay them, then they would get paid, and so therefore they're being exploited. And I think that's an important distinction.
I think that's well said. So you mentioned the 351 D1 schools, the member institutions of the NCAA. Can we talk about the Power 5 conferences, right? Because these conferences are the ones that seem to be making the rules for everyone else, right? That's your Pac-12, your ACC, SEC, Big 12, and who am I missing? Big East?
Big 10.
Big 10. There we go. No, Big 12. That's the Big 10. Good call.
Big 10, Big 12. There's 14 and 10.
Yeah, I know. And the Pac-12 is really the Pac-10, whatever. Anyway, those big schools at those conferences where all the big schools go to, those are the ones that make all the rules, yes?
They drive the rules process. So this is good time to talk a little cartel theory. And while we're talking about economics, when I say cartel, I have nothing to do with drugs. It just means a group of firms that get together and set prices. It happens that drug cartels, they also set prices. That's why they're cartels. The drug part is separate. Whenever you have a cartel, you essentially have to gather, again, all the producers of the business. You generate profits from the collusion, and then you fight over who gets them. And you have the big guys, the big firms in the cartel, and they're like, well, without us, you wouldn't work. This wouldn't work. And you have the small guys saying, look, if we leave and we start competing against you, you're going to lose profits too. So you have to find some equitable agreement. If you look at the history of the NCAA cartel going back to 1956, when the first enforced amateurism rules went in, a lot of people don't know that the NCAA was founded in 1906, but the first 50 years there were no enforced amateurism rules, and lots of college athletes got paid. In 56, the cartel is created, and there is inherently this tension between the schools in the Southern Conference and the schools in the SEC, as an example. The SEC actually had emerged out of the Southern Conference, as did the ACC, because they wanted to give scholarships, and the Southern Conference at the time didn't want to. So in 1973, that split actually results in the creation of D1, D2, and D3. We think of those as being forever ago, but I was alive in 1973, and it wasn't always like that. But that was a way of saying to those really small schools, look, we know you don't want to give scholarships, but get the heck out of our business model and go do your thing, and we'll throw you a few Scooby snacks, but you're not going to make most of the money. 5 years later, in 1978, D1 itself goes, yeah, this isn't working for football. So they split into what's now FBS, FCS, and D1 without football is 1A, 1AA, and 1AAA in the old days. And that was the same thing, which is essentially saying to the schools, if you can't make the commitment to make money in football, you don't get as big of a share of the largesse. And as the O'Bannon case was winding down, and there was this real tension in 2010, when Mark Emmert first started, he came in and said, we're going to start paying something like a cost of attendance stipend. It was sort of a half measure. And the little schools all got together and said, we can't afford to do that. And they overrode it. And at that point, the Power Five said, if you don't give us autonomy to make some form of our own rules, including letting us make a cost of attendance scholarship, because it's costing us. When Terrell Pryor has to sell his pants to be able to afford a discount on tattoos, and we lose his services for a year, that costs us a lot more than $3,500 a year in stipend. And the little schools were like, well, we don't have Terrell Pryor. So essentially, at that point, even though we don't think of it, the autonomy schools created, I almost don't like to think of it as like FAS. We got FAS, FBS, FCS. They created a separate group, and they can make some rules, and then the other conferences have the choice to join on board. So, for example, the cost of attendance rule was passed by the Power Five. They call themselves the Autonomy Five, which is the biggest misnomer because autonomy means acting on your own, but they get together as five conferences and collude. It's a smaller cartel within a cartel, and so they set the rules, and then the other schools can follow. Now, remember, all of those schools said they could never afford it. We're at the point now where something like 270 of the 350 some schools have adopted COA. No one can afford anything until suddenly competition kicks in, and then magically they can.
Victoria, historically, do you want to add a point to that?
Yeah, I would just add, if you look at all the language employed by, the Pac-12 and the Big Ten and the individual schools that were kind of, they would say driving these reform changes around 2014 or so, the language they all use is that we did this. We decided to increase cost of attendance. We decided to return back from 1-year renewable grant need to 4-year and 5-year scholarships. We are providing more health coverage, all of these things, as if, they did it on their own. But any type of expansion in benefits going to the athletes has always been in reaction to pressure from the athletes. And so if you look at the unionization effort led by King Coulter at Northwestern, for example, every plank on his platform is ultimately what was adopted by those schools. So I always read between the lines of those statements because it's always when they're dragging it's done as they're dragging their feet and being forced to do these things and making those changes. And I mean, the history that Andy laid out is perfect. It's the history. I like to go to the local to see how things play out on the ground and then kind of see how national trends play out on the ground and how people put law into practice or how these relationships form. And I studied the University of North Carolina, which, Tobacco Road, basketball school. Of course, basketball is what they care about the most. And it's not historically what UNC cares about the most when it comes to the finances of, their big time athletic departments. It's football because the schools make the money in football. So football is what drives NCAA policy. Historically, since the very beginning and the creation of the NCAA was football. This move in 56 to allow the schools to start granting 4-year scholarships to athletes detached from academic merit. So it's the birth of the athletic scholarship. And then kind of creating the facade of it all being amateur, that what makes it amateur is that it's educational. Now you can do whatever you want because you've slapped this label on it, and you can adopt 1-year renewable scholarships, which looks a lot like an employment contract, but because you have this cloak of it being educational and amateur, that the scholarship, is priceless, you can act as a business and act like they're employees, but because you've scrubbed, and you as Walter Byers have scrubbed the NCAA manual clean of any language that would make them vulnerable, now you can act in that way regardless.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
It's interesting that you said revenue, football, basketball, and amateurism, all things that we know about this sport, but about this institution. But you talked about football and basketball, right? And football being the driver of policy. So we do know that from bowl games and all these variety of things, right? Hundreds of millions of dollars come into these schools. Not only that, you have the live television rights, right? Whether it be the SEC network, Big 12, whomever, right? That's where a lot of these funds come in. When we talk about basketball, right? That 1.2 or 1.3 billion dollars, right, that they get because of the NCAA men's and women's, or just the men's tournament that generates that money from a live sports revenue perspective.
It's like, I think the contracts are something like 90, let's say 92-8.
Got it.
90-10.
Okay. So that's where the money comes in from those sports. But to your point, Andy, you said something earlier. The schools can either decide, and I guess if you're registered as a 501c3, you can't really show all this huge surplus as profits on your balance sheets at the end of your fiscal or calendar year. You got to spend that money somehow. So where does all this money go?
Okay. Try to be brief. So the NCAA is a pass-through organization in the sense that they're the first. The basketball money comes to the NCAA. They keep about 5% to make sure that Mark Emmert gets to live in the style to which he's become accustomed, and then they send the other 95% to their members, like as if it were a dividend. To the stockholders of the NCAA, those are the schools. And there's about 8 different ways that the money gets doled out, but with a few exceptions, and those are the really small numbers, most of the money is skewed towards things that big schools are good at. So the more scholarships you give, the more money you get. Stanford probably gets the most because they have the most sports and they've got the most scholarships in those sports. And it's skewed. So if you give, I've lost track of the numbers, but I think for the first 50 scholarships you give out, you get 1 unit. If you're over 150, the 150th first and thereafter, you get 20 units. Wow. So each additional scholarship beyond 150 is worth 20 times what a small school is getting. So, the golden rule is that the people with the gold make the rules. And so that's the first step. And I think it's important because when you hear things like the NCAA saying 95% of our money goes to support student athletes, and I'm only using that word in quotes, that is essentially them saying, well, we gave our shareholders a dividend. Because when they say money going to support student athletes, they mean we gave the money to the schools, who are our shareholders. So then once the schools have it, a lot of schools in D1, they act as if they explicitly say we want to act like we're a standalone business, and that doesn't really make sense, as Victoria was saying, in the context of higher education, because you don't have a sports program to make a profit. You have a sports program in the best of all worlds to provide services to your campus and to provide a boost to your mission. Like, you can look at the University of Alabama, and they have used the Nick Saban years as a great means of growing the strength of the University of Alabama as an academic institution. I think it's a good example because the campus size has basically increased by about 50% from roughly 20,000 to 30,000. Most of that has been out-of-state, high-achieving students. So it's been a way for them to improve the academic reputation. And when you ask people why would somebody from New York go to Tuscaloosa for college, football is often a reason for it. That's good. That's in the best case scenario. Oftentimes that, you could look at Rutgers and say, well, maybe that's not working so well for them. But when it's working right, that's the idea. But if that's the idea, then saying this is an independent business doesn't make a lot of sense, because the specific goal of the university is like a marketing arm. It's a way of boosting the reputation. And there's all sorts of studies that show that university presidents, even when you go through all of the objective data, they rate their peers higher if they have a good football program. Like it's good marketing, not just to, dumb high school seniors that don't know better, but like people with PhDs who run fellow universities are swayed by this. They go, oh yeah, Michigan's way better than Chicago because Michigan has good football and Chicago doesn't, and things like that. And so the reason I bring this up is it's not an issue so much in Alabama, but the idea that this department should cover its own costs. That's not a common thing in academia. I was a history major. Victoria was a history major. History departments don't make any money. They get a few grants, a national endowment for the humanities, things like that. But for the most part, the way that a history department is paid is that somebody in the central administration of a university says, for every survey course you teach, every student, we're going to give you, I don't even know the amount, $1,000. And so it's a way of inducing certain pro-university conduct by the history department to offer big survey classes so that the science majors can know a tiny bit about American history or something like that, and as well as to generate PhDs and things like that, and to do the things that are dedicated to what the university sees its mission as. But none of those things actually really generate any money for the university. Now, what's weird about sports is that they do generate outside money. And so the way I like to think about it is, let's just say that you have an athletic department that has $90 million in revenue and $100 million in listed costs, so that in the academic accounting, they lose $10 million. And they, again, I'm using quotes on all these words, lose. They need a quote unquote subsidy to cover the rest. I think a better way to think about that is that the school is choosing to spend, not lose, $10 million on athletics to get $100 million worth of value. That's a pretty good ratio. Now, you might want to say, like, well, we spend less on the history department, but everything we get out of the history department is directly on point with why we are a university. And that's not quite so true with football. So of course we'll demand a higher ratio of dollar in to dollar out of value because it's ancillary. But just to say, oh, that athletic department lost $10 million, it's bad, misses the whole point. It's saying like, oh, well, our coupon department didn't generate any revenue at all. And I don't like, well, right. They're trying to sell soda. You're recognizing the value of the soda on the soda department, not on the coupon department. The coupon is a means to an end. And if your coupon department costs you $10 million, if your athletic department costs you $10 million, I don't think anybody can say whether that's good or it's bad without asking, what did you get for it? But when in the media, when you see things, you say, oh, see, we got all this money. We got $1 billion a year from March Madness, another $2 billion in other basketball revenue. We got $9 billion in football, so $12 billion, and we spent it all. It's all gone. And in fact, other than 25 schools, everybody lost money. It's like, no, everybody decided that the correct budget for their school was higher than the outside revenue generated. And they'd made a rational decision to spend that money. If it's smart or dumb, you can't tell from any of those numbers I said. The question is, did it return value? And that's harder to do from the outside. And I don't ever hear anyone talk about that. And that was longer than you wanted, but.
So that extra money, right, that these schools are spending, that they need that subsidy for, you mentioned Stanford getting a ton of money, right? So ostensibly that money goes to those millions of other sports that they have, right? So forget about football and basketball and things, it's crew, swimming, lacrosse, golf, sailing, all these other ancillary sports that typically tend to benefit a certain looking athlete. And Victoria, I want to talk to you about that. What role does race play historically, right? Because that's your bag from the NCAA. And then now, as we move forward, as they look at whom they decide to spend the money on.
Yeah, a couple things. So first, all the Power 5 schools, the majority of the Power 5 schools, if not all the Power 5 schools, are PWIs, or, if we're in the South, historically white institutions. And, we can track kind of these parallel changes taking place. Sometimes they're interrelated. And, as schools are making more money through sports, as they're changing the rules so that they restrict the rights of athletes more, the rules changes that we've been talking about that begin in the 60s and reach their high point in the 70s and continue on, that's when the rosters of those revenue generating sports become majority Black. So they go from almost entirely white with a few exceptions here and there to heavily majority Black, especially in the Power Five. And the non-revenue generating sports are heavily majority white. So we can't ignore the fact that there's a differential experience taking place, though a lot of the pressures those athletes in the revenue generating sports of football and basketball feel are also felt by athletes in other non-revenue, in the non-revenue generating sports, particularly those with heavy travel and seasons where they play lots and lots of games. There's still a difference in experience. And then because, I often say that college sports are a technicolor illustration of the failure of residential and educational desegregation in the U.S., many of the athletes playing the non-revenue sports have grown up with privileged backgrounds and access to better quality K-12 schools. So I use my story to illustrate this. Growing up in a wealthy suburb of Chicago, Lake Forest, where I had a woman athletic director who built gender equity into everything we did, and in a school district that only had one high school in it with lots of resources, we had all the sports. And that, as a historian, timing always matters too. And I was in high school in the late 90s. The late 90s was a period of boom and a period of attention and widespread support for girls and women in sport. If you remember, coming off the Atlanta Olympics, there was a lot of attention and energy around like girl power and things like that. It also matters that the economy was somewhat booming comparatively to other times, and that, Bill Clinton was in the White House and was a fan of women's sports. And then you have the 1999 Women's World Cup, and that kind of mass popular culture support for women in sport is actually very much what we saw in 2019 before all of this, before the shit hit the fan, right? And so my high school had all these sports that most schools don't have. Lacrosse, water polo, field hockey. And because this was a moment of kind of broad social, cultural, and political support for women in sports, and because college sports were continuing to accelerate the money that they were making, schools were adding all these women's teams. So my graduating class from high school had a disproportionately high number of women going on to play college sports, field hockey, those so-called country club sports that really just mean sports where, you have to have a level of privilege and exposure and opportunity to play that just simply aren't in every school. So, college sports, these things, and at the athletic department level, that athletic department went from all white and all male to now you have to provide sports for women, and the rosters becoming majority Black in like a split second. So if you go and look at the correspondence or, any of the memos circulating in athletic departments, particularly in the South in the 1970s and 80s, my goodness, the sky is falling. And it's really interesting that these things kind of all happen around the same time. Just to wrap up this, I do think they're interconnected, not intentionally, but I think what evolves, what comes out of this is kind of this philosophy or rhetoric of the broad, expansive athletic department that's heavily dependent on Black athletes in football and men's basketball so that everyone else can thrive, but then that everyone else that's thriving provides kind of a shield. In the case of women, it's a Title IX shield to justify the ratcheting up on the pressure on those athletes to make money, to justify, and it's good that we have all these sports. They're educational. Look, our athletes are graduating. And so you point to the people like me and say, look, it's there. And then you blame the athletes who can't create the experience that I enjoy because of the pressures of their sport, or the high schools that they attended, and you blame the athlete rather than the system when they have a harder time keeping up their grades or staying to graduate.
This is excellent.
I think that's really important. I think remember, amateurism comes out of Victorian England. They gussied it up by saying it was Greek, but it wasn't. And when it came to America, it was a very racist, segregated America, where basically black people didn't go to college. So you didn't need to. It wasn't racist. Amateurism per se wasn't racist as it's being imposed into the collegiate mindset. Segregation was doing that job just fine.
Right.
And but it has served as a good backstop as segregation has become untenable for people who would want to maintain that sort of caste system or whatever you want to call it. And so I went to a public high school that had a sailing team, and I was a varsity sailor on our team. So, talking about coming from privilege. And here's the thought experiment to do. The very first college sport that got people earned money in was actually rowing. Something like $500 for the winner of a race between Harvard and Yale, and per rower. And in 18 whatever, when that was a lot of money.
That's pretty good.
Yeah. So imagine if college sailing was the revenue sport. America's Cup, right? Yeah. And the rhetoric that Victoria just explained was that, well, of course we can't pay the sailors because they have to sail for the love of the sea, and we need all that money to support these basketball teams.
Oh, hell no.
Can you imagine what the Fox outrage machine would be saying about why are we taking money from these hardworking, young, strapping men with their Ivy League educations, blah blah blah, and like it just doesn't compute. And
their boat shoes.
Right, exactly. And these are the future hedge fund managers of the world, and we're not letting them experience the true American economy for some socialist system that we're subsidizing all these poor basketball players. And it would go away. And as a side note, around the time that I was applying to college, there was a conspiracy among the Ivy League schools and MIT not to offer academic merit scholarships to anybody, and to standardize the need-based aid that they gave. And the Department of Justice, filled with a bunch of guys who had gone to the Ivy Leagues, found out about this. They met in my hometown of Wellesley, Massachusetts, this organization. And they said, that's a price-fixing cartel. You can't do that anymore. And they broke it up. And I think the only way you can explain why the same DOJ hasn't looked at the NCAA and said that is because the victims don't seem like the DOJ lawyers, and the beneficiaries do. So that's I think a big part of it.
That's always how it goes. This is why I wanted to have you two on, because again, for our audience, you guys have the historical knowledge, and you can go back and just give us all the context. So I want to fast forward now, right? Okay. So there is a world in which we might not have a college football season, although Dabo Swinney and Mike Gundy would like to say otherwise. Right, exactly, Victoria. So the things I'm hearing are, well, first of all, the NCAA lost $375 million because the men's basketball tournament was canceled. And the average Power 5 school makes $120 million a year from $100 million from football. So they're not going to have that if there's no season. Donations will decrease, right? Because the idea is if there's a sort of a constricting of like your purse, you're not giving out money freely because what am I doing? There's no football to watch. State schools, in theory, I guess, would also get less government funding, right? And then obviously your MAC conference schools will be more affected than your SEC schools because of what we just talked about. And then you have Power 5 ADs saying, we forecast a 30% drop in revenue for 2020, 2021. So if all those things are the case and we have no football come this fall, oh my God, is the sky falling? Like what is going to happen?
Gosh. So I like to let's jump ahead 2 years. Let's be in 2023. In 2023, do we think there's still going to be demand for college sports? Yes. Do we think there are going to be nice facilities for having college sports? Yes. Do we think that there are going to be athletes who want to participate in college sports at the whatever the going rate is, whether it's a scholarship or a scholarship plus? Yes. So it doesn't seem to me like this is a long-term problem. This is just a budgetary shortfall for a couple years. Now, this is where the interests of the athletic director and the coaches start to diverge greatly from the university. If the university is maybe not even open next fall or is only having online classes, not paying anybody to run an athletic department might be smart. But to the athletic department, that's not smart. To the athletic director, it's like, wait, whoa. And so I think that the real crisis is that the guys who are used to taking all of the surplus are really upset that there won't be surplus for a couple years to take. And so, and that may involve lots of pain to small people too, small income people. They're probably taller than I am. Right, like, there could be a administrative assistant in the athletic department who gets furloughed, and I'm not trying to say that his or her life is not going to be really screwed by that, but the health of the university is almost unrelated to this. The health of the university is about when can we get students back on campus, paying tuition, learning, doing the things that they do, and once we do that, even if we laid everybody off and we fired the entire athletic department, are they not going to come back? Are there, it's like we'll be able to recover. So unlike the little businesses in my neighborhood that, it's expensive to restart a shop if you've laid everybody off and you've lost your lease and you've had to declare bankruptcy. The schools will still be there and healthy 2 years from now. So it doesn't strike me as a long-term problem. As a short-term problem, yeah, they're screwed. And I think we've seen it in college basketball. The college basketball coaching carousel, where a bunch of guys get fired and paid big bucks, and then a bunch of new guys get hired with even higher salaries and even bigger buyouts, sort of ground to a halt. Danny Manning being the one exception at Wake Forest. He was recently let go and allegedly has a $15 million buyout.
Who paid that money?
Well, I listened to a competitor of yours, a good podcast, and they walked it through, and it was the previous athletic director who was buddy with the guy, and it's like insider dealing. Again, you have divergence between the interests of the athletic director and the interests of the university. So I think we will see some short-term economizing by athletic departments, and I think we'll see essentially schools paying money to people who aren't actually, like, if you have a contract, they probably are going to have to pay Jim Harbaugh his money, whether he does his job or not. And unlike many people at the university, people in the athletic department are not at will employees. They're contract employees. So you have to pay them unless they agree. And you see all these guys generously giving 10% back of their salary. But so I think that all of this we should take in the context of, like, I don't really know what's going to happen next year. Maybe they'll play a split season. Maybe they'll push the basketball season around. I would hope that they don't start playing basketball during the PCL's launch time. But it's all about just sort of like getting by until they can resume again. And once they can resume again, I think everyone's safe. They can have their Saturday football games just like they always had them.
Victoria, you obviously are intimately familiar with both ends of this, right? Not only as an athlete, but also as an actual member of faculty at a school. So this idea of, playing sports when there aren't even kids on campus, what are you hearing from, the educational side in terms of what it's going to potentially look like? And Andy mentioned some real things where, your entire sort of life can be radically different when this all emerges.
Yeah. Thanks. I really worry about our students, and I really worry about our students who play sports. I'm at Arizona State University, and we're marked by not by who we exclude, but by whom we include and how we help them excel and achieve, which means that we have a lot of non-traditional students. We have a lot of students who have to work to support themselves to go to college, and if they've been laid off. They can no longer go to college. And with regard to our students who play sports, not just at ASU, but everywhere, this population experiences mental health issues at a disproportionately high rate. And often when I speak with student athletes, I always try to get a sense of how they're doing. And one thing I'm often worried about is how athletes cope with injury. And I see this as something that athletes are dealing with in a way that's similar to injury. When you shockingly, surprisingly, unexpecting have your sport taken away from you, it's really hard to cope with that. Fortunately, our athletes have years and years of resilience training. They're really good at making it through really tough times, and they can draw on that training. But the question mark of when things come back is the hard part, because we're so good at planning and scheduling and putting things on our calendar and having those, points that we can check off, those points of progress that we can check off. But if we don't know, and when college athletes' timelines are so short, depending on what year they are, they may have only, if 2023 is what we're looking at, the majority of our students who are on campus now will be gone by then. So I'm very concerned about that. One thing I am kind of more optimistic about is that, those of us who have been vocal in the college sports reform space have been saying, for, nearly a century now, that we've lost our way, that higher education has lost its way. And, it just has accelerated over time that we've lost our way. And I'm hopeful that, the couple examples that Andy gave about these ridiculous buyouts that coaches get, the salary escalation, the bring your buddies with you, the rehabilitation center that's going on in Alabama for fired coaches. My goodness, it would be so great if this unexpected thing has the positive result of us kind of shaking back into our senses and realizing so many of the things that we've been doing have nothing to do with serving our students who play sports. I would like to see that as a positive outcome from this horrible, experience that our athletes are going through.
We started off talking about, when I was going through Andy's bio, SB 206, right? And I know the NCAA has some major announcement coming soon. I don't, knowing the three people on this podcast, we're not very optimistic as to what that's going to be, right? But this isn't, it's always, I think of moments of crisis as moments of opportunity, right? Like, if the right people can sit down and get together, real actual change can be enacted. But I don't think either of us has hope that this is going to happen. But what are ways in which you think right now is something that they can do easily, simply right now? Wouldn't even require 78-5 working committees and 16 years. We don't need all that. Really quick, here's what we can do right now that will make life so much easier for everybody, and it's not going to upset, quote unquote, the apple cart. For each of you, what would one or two things be? Victoria, I'll start with you and we'll go to Andy.
Treat students who play sports like all students. Don't treat them categorically different. Is one thing. So that would mean, the opportunity for athletes to make money off their name, image, and likeness from third parties, the ability to give lessons, all those things, just like any other student at the university who could do who's on scholarship. I see that coupled with a kind of reinvigorated embrace of education in the athletic space and a rethinking of what athlete education means. Those two things together. And that's not necessarily pegged to this current moment in crisis. But the one that's more tied to it is our athletes who are economically vulnerable. We really need to loosen, and maybe at first temporarily, and then we see the sky isn't going to fall, and then permanently completely remove the restrictions on athletes being able to get money from third parties.
Yeah, so you asked us for stuff that would be easy, and I don't think that any of the things that Victoria said are easy for the NCAA because they have it has to be, and so that we don't have to give up any of our money. Otherwise, that's hard for them. And people talk about NIL being, name, image, and likeness, endorsements, being free. Like it's not going to cost the school at all. But of course, it's going to cost the school. It's going to cost the school control because as soon as you start having athletes that are making six figures in endorsements, it's harder to tell him that he's worthless and weak and he needs to come to practice more often or he's never going to make it and he's going to get cut from the team. And it's also some of the money that flows in to be the official car dealer of Clemson football is going to be smaller if somebody else is the official car dealer of Trevor Lawrence. And so it could cost the schools money, and that makes it that doesn't make it impossible, but that makes it very, very difficult to make any real change. Like you said, we're waiting to see what the NCAA says. The rumors that are out there are quite positive for athletes, which is one of the reasons I don't believe them, because there are no athletes involved in the making of this policy, and so it's very hard to get a equitable outcome if it's only one side of the table negotiating amongst itself between the people who want to dole out some and the people who want to dole out less, as opposed to the people who want all of their rights, all of their value, bargaining with people who want to give them some or none of their value, and you find some sort of normal, like collective bargaining outcome or something like that. But I think this is important. The organization that I'm involved in, the Professional Collegiate League, we are in the process of getting ready to launch in June of 2020, and we're going to have an NIL committee too, or maybe a person. And his job or her job is going to be to scrutinize every contract that one of our athletes signs to make sure the athlete is not getting taken advantage of by the third party and being paid too little. If you look at the information that's been leaked about what's coming out of the NCAA, they're going to have a committee that's job it is to make sure the athlete's not being paid too much. and that difference in perspective, I think we can step back a second and talk about how it's really in the PCL, we see athletes as having economic rights, and we're going to build a thriving, profitable league on the assumption that we have to respect those rights because rights trump wishes, privileges, rights are rights. They're an entitlement. The NCAA's view, even if what comes out today or whenever we hear about it is wonderful, is still predicated on the idea that the NCAA owns this property, and they're deciding how much of it they're going to allow athletes to sort of get back as a rebate. Like, we're going to take it all, and then we'll share it out. We're going to give some to Victoria, we're going to give some to Andy, some to Jarod, and then you can keep the rest. You can have some of it back. And until that changes, even if this is, I'm reminded of, I hate to use the word I'm going to use, but I'm reminded of the title of Curt Flood's biography, autobiography, which is A Well-Paid Slave. And Howard Cosell asked him on TV, and he said, a well-paid slave is still a slave. I am not saying that the conditions that college athletes are akin to slavery, but I do think it's akin to indentured servitude, which is its cousin. And in an indentured servitude situation, the master doesn't have to give the servant much more than room, board, and sort of living expenses to get by, and the tools of the trade. And so if you're coming at it with this indentured servitude perspective, where the value that I create is not mine, it's yours, and then you're going to share some of it back to me as much as I need, you're never going to get to a good, just outcome. And it's never going to be easy. And that's to get back to your point. It's never going to be easy to convince the people who are benefiting from the largesse to reduce what they're getting.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things that it's been so interesting and sort of as we're watching things change, and as athletes come in, particularly the ones in the revenue-generating sports, are getting smarter about their value and what's going on. It's, of course, more difficult in football because we've seen football leagues start and fold, right? It's almost impossible just because of the amount of people you need, the money it costs to run the league. But, of course, if enough wealthy people got together, they could create something that would rival the NCAA system. But in basketball, with what you're doing, Andy, at the PCL, with what the NBA G League is doing, right? 3 or 4 of the top 10 commits coming in have already said, nah, forget the scholarship stuff. We're going to the G League. We're getting a paycheck, and we're doing that. I'm wondering if at least college basketball will change a little bit. And look, the schools that want to have their people who want to come for 4 years, knock yourselves out. You can do that. And as Victoria has so fondly told me many times, everybody's a football, you can still do your hang on sloopy, dot your I, all your funny things that you like, and nothing about the fundamental experience about you as a fan of the school or your alma mater is going to change. Nothing. You have everything you still want. You just may not have the top people go there. And I'm okay with that.
Yeah, I agree. The big difference between football and basketball, Victoria pointed this out, football is far more profitable than basketball, but basketball has a much higher return on investment. So it takes a lot of money to generate profits in football. It doesn't take nearly as much to put 10 guys in shorts and have them go out on a court and play. The facilities are less expensive. And as we evolve away from sports, you can see it now in this COVID-19 world. And this is something that at the PCL we're thinking about a lot because we're going to be launching next summer. And it's not clear whether live sport, in-person sports are going to happen or not. Or if they do, whether they can be normal, like we've come to think of them. Basketball is nowhere near as dependent on people showing up at the arena as football is. And so it's just a very different sport. If you take what the G League is doing, as best we understand, is that right now their plans are to get something on the order of, say, 6 to 10 guys, essentially the people who would be going direct from high school to the NBA if the one and done rule wasn't there. Mm-hmm. And that's a union bargain negotiation, and the contract doesn't come up for another couple years. It's pretty clear that the players, in exchange for giving that up, are going to ask for other things. So I see what the G League has done, it's really the NBA has done. It's really more an end around the union. Okay, you won't let us bring in these 10 guys. The NCAA is begging us to take these guys off their hands because the NCAA thinks, oh, if those 10 guys go, then nobody else is worth a dime. And so we're going to park them on this. It's almost like the Harlem Globetrotters of old. It's a team that's going to be a travel team, almost like a high-end AAU team for guys who would be college freshmen. But I don't think, as I understand it, they're going to be going to school. So it's just this thing that stands by itself. The space is still wide open, and the question is, and that's really our idea is, can we get together enough people with financial wherewithal who want to invest in essentially becoming the best power conference in college, but not within the amateur structure?
Makes sense. Victoria, I will give you the last word.
Oh, goodness. Well, I teach this stuff. I have conversations with students about it all the time, and we all talk about this stuff all the time. And especially in the last 10 years, a lot of it was, what's going to be the one thing that disrupts this? Or, is it going to be the O'Bannon case? Or is it going to be king culture and unionization? Or are they going to have some sort of sit down or strike at March Madness? And it turned out that thing could be or might be a pandemic, this thing that we never expected. Now, if you look at the long history, like that suggests that the system will survive, that it's going to be a temporary, crisis, bigger than ever. But eventually, things will continue their snowball escalation ride. I don't know necessarily if that's the case, because there's a much bigger crisis than college sports happening right now. That we're going to enter a really deep recession, global recession or depression. And, those broadcasting rights and media contracts might be reduced dramatically. Some schools might even go out of business, let alone have their athletic departments go out of business. So it's so hard to make predictions right now while we're in the middle of it. But I am so looking forward to 10 years from now, 20 years from now. I'm really optimistic and hopeful that we can reflect back on this period as the moment we came back to our senses. History suggests it's not going to be the case, but the optimist in me is hopeful that we get some sort of sense back of what this is all for. And it's to serve our students and our communities. And we can do both things if we do it responsibly. I think the best example of how frustrating it is that we had lost our way is, and I'm not saying this to be critical of Amy Perko and the Knight Commission, but one quote I read from hers really underscores it all for me. She, because she's pushing back against this letter from the Group of Five to Mark Emmert asking for a loosening of the requirement to have at least 16 sports to be a member of the Group of Five. And, saying we shouldn't be cutting teams, we can cut costs in other ways. And the ways she suggested was one of the ways she suggested. She made a lot of great recommendations. One was a conference realignment so that conferences would be regional. And my goodness, she is the CEO of the Knight Commission. The Knight Commission was created by university presidents, Theodore Hesburgh and Bill Friday of Notre Dame and UNC to have a reform institution to make college sports better, coming off the crises, these academic fraud crises of the 90s. And, there's a lot of university presidential power behind the Knight Commission. Well, those university presidents signed off on the conference realignment that made the Power Fives nearly national in scope, some of them at least. And so that, to me, we know how to do this. We have been choosing not to do this, and hopefully 10 years, 20 years from now, when I come back and watch and listen to this interview, I'll be like, wow, she was prophetic. I don't think that's, well, yes, I'm just going to leave it like that. Wow, she was prophetic.
Victoria Jackson, where can the people find you?
Well, hit me up via email. I'm just victoria.jackson@asu.edu. On Twitter, I'm at History Runner. And
Andy Schwarz, where can the people find you?
Well, first of all, check out the PCL website. It's www.thepcleague.com, and I'm active on Twitter. I'm at Andy HRE, Holy Roman Emperor.
This was incredible, guys. You guys have been really, really helpful in this conversation. I really look forward to this conversation. Hopefully we can have more going forward, possibly on more of these Skype or Zoom chats. But that was another episode of the 7 Footers Basketball Podcast. You know where to find us. At 7 Footers Pod on Twitter, at 7 Footers Podcast on Instagram, at JS Hector on both platforms, YouTube, Apple, Spotify, all the things. We'll see you guys later. Take care.
Spent a couple years out here with these raps, trying to have a plan that we made come true. Applied to some jobs, but I ain't hit back. I don't wanna trap, what's a man gonna do? Chevy told me come